to Tomorrow Never Knows with me, Bob Wilson, and Sir Warren Brown of the Beatles Kingdom. Tonight we welcome Professor Joseph McBride, a wonder boy on all subjects ranging from film to politics to script writing. It doesn't stop there. Joe's works include, but they're definitely not limited to, Into the Nightmare, My Search for the Killers of President John F. Kennedy and Officer J.D. Tippit, Unmasking Frank Capra, How Did Lubitsch Do It, and The Broken Places, which is the only book that made me cry while I read it. It was quite a moving piece. But first, a word from our sponsor before we get to the great interview with our friend Joe McBride. Beatles Magazine is a publication with 370 plus million visitors in all their pages, read by thousands of fans around the world each and every day. Beatles news is updated daily, 24 hours, audio, video, photos, interviews, even contests, additional materials, and more. So follow Beatles Magazine, the most complete online coverage, 24 hours a day and 8 days a week. So welcome, Joseph.
Hi, great to be with you again, Bob, and Warren, too.
And welcome, Joseph, and nice to meet you, my friend.
Yeah, good to meet you.
Thank you.
You've done so much in the area of film on many levels. It spans a wide spectrum. How did the medium of film become so important to you?
Well, I guess as a kid in the 50s, I was going to movies on weekends, matinees every Saturday, and I would go to the local theater and see first-run films. Actually, in those days, the big films would come downtown first. I lived in Milwaukee, so I'd take the bus downtown and see films like Judgment in Nuremberg, Diary of Anne Frank, serious films. I was into good films back then, and then I was my father had tickets for the local theaters in Milwaukee. He was with the Milwaukee Journal, so I got free tickets. And then so I became a film fanatic, and I watched a lot of films on television, and I was pretty well versed in popular culture, and I wanted to, when I got to college, I was going to be a journalist and novelist. And I've been a journalist since 1960, actually. And my parents were journalists, but I discovered film in a big way at the University of Wisconsin. And the late 60s was when the film culture revolution really hit America. And so I saw Citizen Kane in a film class in 1966, and that changed my whole life. I suddenly thought, well, I want to make films and write about films. So I've been doing that my whole life. And haven't written a novel, although I tried, but I've written a lot of books. I've been writing books since 1963, mostly about films, but some about politics. And thank you for the nice comment on The Broken Places. That means a lot to me, obviously, because it's my personal memoir of my troubled youth, which helps explain rock and roll high school, why I liked the Ramones, and the Beatles were coming in at the same time.
When I read your list of works, it was definitely brief. You have many more than that. I just wanted to sneak in 2 words, and you can go with them where you will. Orson Welles.
Yeah. Well, he's somebody I've been studying my whole life. Well, my whole adult life, I guess you'd have to say. As I mentioned, he got me into serious filmmaking. I mean, I was kind of primed for it, but when I started seeing his films, I thought, well, I want to read a book about him. There wasn't a good book in English, and so I thought I'll write one. And I'd already written a book on baseball when I was in high school, and it didn't get published for a long time, but I kind of knew how to write a book. So I was going to write a whole book on Citizen Kane, and then I started seeing his other films and realized he had made a lot of other great films, Touch of Evil and Chimes of Midnight came out that year, and a lot of stuff. And so I expanded, and I spent 4 years writing a book about him. And at the end of the 4 years, I was working also on a book on John Ford, my favorite director, with Michael Wilmington. And I went to Hollywood to interview Ford in 1970. And Welles, I thought, was in Europe. He was blacklisted and went to Europe for from 47 until 1970, more or less, and with a few trips to America. But anyway, Peter Bogdanovich, I looked him up. He was just a young scholar and filmmaker who I thought was very promising. And he said, I'm on the other line with Orson. Would you hold on? and I was stunned that Welles was in Hollywood. I had no idea. And Welles told me to call him, and I called him, and he said, "We're about to start shooting a film. Would you like to be in it?" And I was totally flabbergasted because it's like a Walter Mitty dream to be in an Orson Welles film. And all I could think of saying was, "Is this going to be a feature-length film?" I thought it was going to be some little short. And he laughed, and he said, "Well, we certainly hope so." And that was a dumb question, but it was also it proved to be a good question because it took 48 years to become a feature-length film. We shot it for 6 years, The Other Side of the Wind, which is a satirical drama about Hollywood. And it finally came out in 2018 through Netflix, and it's still running on Netflix if listeners want to watch it. It came out very well. It was put together. He edited parts of it before he died, but he ran into all kinds of financial and legal and political problems to try to finish it. So it was finished by Frank Marshall and Peter Bogdanovich and Philip Jan Rimza, another producer. And they did a great job. Bob Murawski did a great job of editing 96 hours of footage in the style the Welles planned, and I was an advisor on the completion. So it was that was kind of my film school. You know, I was a rebel against the educational system back then, and so I was studying film on my own because we only had 3 film classes, and I took them, and so I ran the local film society on campus, and we had many film societies. Every night you'd have like 10 films you could choose from. And all day long, the university very kindly let me look at films that came in for different classes, you know, like even history classes and literature classes and stuff. And so all day long I was watching films, and then at night, and then I'd go home and work on my book on Welles. So that was the genesis of the whole thing.
Well, The Broken Places, I think, was a piece of work that Beatles and Ramones fans would identify with. I know when people go on shows, everybody talks everything up, but it's honestly one of my favorite books. As I mentioned before, in part of the book that you'd written a story about, you know, your friend Kathy with her dress when she was tormented by some of her peers. It actually brought me to tears. I can't ever remember crying when I read a book before, but there's a lot in it. It's very interesting, and I recommend it to anybody. You know, Ramones fans, I think, would really identify, and Beatles fans as well, I think, would like that. You mentioned those experiences made it a little easier to understand the Ramones, but school seems to have been, as you alluded to, quite a torturous experience for you. Would you want to go into that a little bit and how maybe it overlaps with the Ramones experience?
Yeah, the Ramones, who star in Rock and Roll High School, you know, I was actually into rock and roll at the very beginning in 1955. I mean, Shaboom was, I guess, the beginning of rock and roll in '54, but Rock Around the Clock, the Bill Haley song, came out, and that was '55. So that's the official start. And I had a little friend named Dickie Swearingen, excuse me, who was very into pop culture, and he got me into rock. He was in it the first week. I mean, he bought the record the first week. So the second week, I bought the record, and I was a rock fan. So the Ramones reminded me of early rock because they have a hard, heavy beat you can dance to, as Dick Clark used to say, and good lyrics you can understand, and, you know, funny and painful subject matter, etc. So that stems from my early rock and roll fondness. But there's a character in the story, Riff Randall, who's the Ramones' #1 fan, who's wonderfully played by P.J. Soles. And so when I was recruited to write that film at Roger Corman's company, which is a funny story, but anyway, I wanted to create, I had to create the plot because they didn't have a plot. They just wanted to do a film called Rock and Roll High School and have some band visit a high school, and that was about it. But they needed a plot, and my father, Ray McBride, who had been a reporter at the Market Journal, as I said, he was in 1928 led a student strike at Superior Central High School in Wisconsin, and he was the student body president. They had a strike for a month because a teacher they loved got fired, and so I thought, I'd filed that away like writers do, thinking of ideas you could make a film out of it. I thought it was a little tame for 1970s, and then I combined it with the blowing up of a building on campus, University of Wisconsin, 1970. The student radical group blew up an Army math research building as a protest against the Vietnam War, and they killed a graduate student. And it helped end the anti-war movement. Unfortunately, it was a big mistake, and because it turned off a lot of people who were not violent, and the war went on and on. And so I thought, okay, that'll be a good ending. So I politicized the story, and I wanted to make it the kids rebelling. And we were also kind of thinking, let's spoof 50s rock and roll films, which are usually about kids rebelling against parents. You know, that's the theme of juvenile delinquency, as they called it back then. And so I thought, well, let's make it more serious and have some political meaning. And so it becomes about a fascist kind of high school and fascist principal. And I could relate to that because I was really abused by some of the nuns in Catholic grade school that I write about in The Broken Places. And in high school, I went to a very good Jesuit high school, Marquette University High School in Milwaukee. And I had a very good education, but some of the teachers were sadistic. You couldn't get away with it today, but we had a school disciplinarian who would actually whip us on the ass with a sawed-off golf club, if you can believe that.
Jesus.
And, you know, and I was working so hard, pushing myself to be a great student that I had a nervous breakdown in high school. It was also physical because I was anorexic. I was not eating. I was in really bad shape. And I was put in a mental institution in the middle of my senior year. And that was actually, in retrospect, the best thing that ever happened to me because it got me out of school. It got me out of home. And it made me kind of turn away from all the repressive things that I'd been raised with, the Catholic Church and everything else. But I met a girl who I'd never met a girl before because it was a boys' school. And I was very conflicted about sexuality. So I met this wonderful girl there, Kathy, as I call her in the book. And she was what they called schizophrenic. Today, they're more subtle in their diagnoses, but she had some really serious chemical imbalance problem and some other issues. And she was going in and out of different identities and things. And so she was a wonderful person, brilliant person, very kind. She kind of helped me out of my shell, but she would be very, very disturbed. Like I was just thinking about, for 2 weeks, she thought she was Barbara Streisand. So I had to call her Barbara, and she would be singing People all the time. And, you know, and then later I wrote a script for Barbara Streisand. I didn't tell them I had dated Barbara Streisand. You know, I thought they would think I was crazy. But it actually helped me write for Barbara Streisand because I understood, you know, how the character talked. And
Sure.
Anyway, so that's in Broken Places. So I modeled Riff on her. Riff is not crazy, but she's a rebel. And Kathy was a rebel. And then the other girl, Kate, who's the studious but sexy girl, but demure, and she becomes radicalized in the film. Day Young plays her very well, and I modeled her on another girlfriend I had named Laurel Gilbert. I had only one weekend to come up with the plot for this film, and I put all this together in one weekend. And
That's amazing.
so, you know, it was a fun film to write, and I got to meet the Ramones, which was a real trip, you know.
For sure. When you met the Ramones and such, and you know, they were hanging out doing their thing and you know, trying to act.
Yeah.
I say trying, but I mean it fit for that kind of a movie. It worked well. But I mean, I recall you telling me once there was a lot of concert footage shot at the Rainbow Room on the Sunset Strip, and I think about 22 minutes of footage took about 14 hours to record. You know, to
Yeah, I think it was 18 hours. I was there. I was an extra. They wanted extras, and one way they did it was selling tickets. Is very clever. It was such a low budget film. They put up signs and said, "Come see a Ramones concert for, I don't know, $10 or whatever it was," and people were happy to pay. So they made some money off that, and so the Ramones played their songs over and over again, and it was kind of a exhausting day, of course, but very exciting. And Alan Arkush, the director, who really loves rock and roll, he understands it well, and it's quite a thing to break up a movie and have a 22-minute concert in the middle. But it's just great to see the Ramones at length, do some of their best songs, and I think it works great. And the Rainbow was a famous nightclub on Sunset Strip. That's where a lot of stars used to hang out and all that. And right down the street is the Whiskey A Go Go, which is another famous place where a lot of great rock people would perform. And the backstage scenes were done there. But and on the DVD and Blu-ray, they have some of the original tracks. It was so noisy and it was hard to get good sound there that they re-recorded the songs, but they have the original tracks on the home video, and it just came out again. The 40th anniversary edition just came out with a lot of extras and stuff, and it's great that the film is. We really didn't think it would be seen. 40 years is hard to imagine. Because it was just a very low budget film that nobody paid attention to in Hollywood. I was writing this Streisand script, and I remember on the Monday I came and I told the story editor we just blew up a high school on Friday for this film. She just kind of looked at me like, what the fuck? She couldn't relate to this really important scene that was shot. I mean, it just didn't exist in the eyes of Hollywood.
She wouldn't do the cameo.
Huh?
So she wouldn't come in and do a cameo for you.
No, she should have. But it was, there are books. A couple books on musicals of the. Well, there's one book, A History of Film Musicals, and there's one on Hollywood musicals of the 70s, and Rock and Roll High School isn't even mentioned, And I'm not saying it's as good as Cabaret, which is probably the best musical of that period, but there's all kinds of garbagey musicals that people write about, but they ignore Rock and Roll High School, some people, in the official histories because it's a B movie, and that's always the way it is. But it has a cult following, which means it failed on its original release. Roger Corman, who produced it, was and is a legendary B movie producer, but he had a formula for releasing films, which was to start in the Southwest in drive-ins and neighborhood theaters. And one of the theaters where it opened was the Texas Theater in Oak Cliff, Texas, where Lee Harvey Oswald was captured, which I always thought was interesting. And but it bombed in those places because it was a different kind of film, and the Ramones, it's the only film they ever acted in. They were in some documentaries, but it didn't have any names that would draw people in. And the Ramones were kind of a fringe taste at the time because the mainstream radio stations wouldn't play their records. So the film just disappeared until it played as a midnight movie in Chicago, and Siskel and Ebert gave it a good review, and that kickstarted the film. And it started playing midnight screenings around the country and did very well for, 2 or 3 years. And then MTV picked it up. It was the first feature ever shown on MTV, and it did well. But after that, no theater would book it because it had already been on TV. And it kind of disappeared for a while, but it kept coming back then on DVD and VHS. And it has a cult following, which is great, many people come up to me and say it's one of their favorite films, and students tell me that, and I'd like to hope they're telling me the truth, but I think they are.
It's one of the most memorable movies to me, and being, I grew up in the area where the Ramones grew up. They were older than me, but I got to meet them a couple of them at different times and saw all of them in person and in concerts. But I think that type of movie captures something in their essence. It's perfect for who they were. And as their legacy comes out, I think that's the kind of that movie speaks to the Ramones. That's the kind of movie you could picture them sitting around watching. But what was the Streisand production that you were writing at the time?
Well, I was writing a movie called Big Money, which is a good title. Everybody got excited about the title. It was about the quiz show scandals of the 50s, which I remembered well because I was watching all those shows. And the quiz shows were revealed to be dishonest and rigged, and there was a big scandal. And it was one of the first. I'm always interested in things that reveal the hidden truths in our society. That behind the facade there's a lot of corruption, and that. So I wrote a script about that, and three friends of mine had written a storyline, and I wrote the screenplay, sold it to Streisand. Ron Howard made an offer for it too. He was just starting to direct television. And in retrospect, I wish I'd gone with Ron Howard because he probably would have made it, and he was good. He would have been good for the male lead. But Streisand was the biggest female star at the time, and I liked her work, and she was going to make her directorial debut with it and star. She wanted John Voight to play the guy, and she would have played the associate producer on the show who helps rig the show, and then she has a conscience and she starts changing her mind and falls in love with one of the contestants who she's manipulating. It's kind of like a Frank Capra film. I always like Frank Capra's films, and unfortunately, after I did a rewrite for Streisand, which I liked, John Peters came in. Her boyfriend took over her film company, and as they sometimes do, they dropped all the projects that they were working on. You know, that's typical Hollywood, because if a film does well that somebody else started, they don't get any credit for it. So it was very disappointing that that film was dropped, and then I had trouble selling it after that. And it was partly the stigma of having it had been rejected, but also I think it was, since it was critical of show business, I had some pushback from people about that. One studio head told me I'd never make a film about the quiz show scandals because it reflects badly on the film industry or the TV industry. But then, of course, Robert Redford made a film called Quiz Show later. It was a pretty good film, but that was the film I was working on for Streisand.
Well, that's some big names there where you belong up with. Impressive stuff, and I hand over to Warren.
Thank you, Bulldog. I appreciate it. Rock and Roll High School had music by the Ramones, Paul McCartney, Lou Reed, Chuck Berry. When you think of that soundtrack, what comes to mind? It had very incredible graphics. I'm a graphic designer myself, and that makes a great classic poster that is off the charts, in my opinion. What can you tell us about that also?
Yeah, the poster is great, and one of the Mad Magazine artists did the poster. It was just wonderful. It was kind of a takeoff on the Animal House poster, but you know, it really captured the film pretty well. It was really a nice job, and a wonderful piece of art, and very funny. The musical score is fantastic. We have, I think it's like 45 songs in the film, which is amazing for a $280,000 film. Today you couldn't do that because they charge so much for rights, you know. But we had a woman who was whose name was Jane Alsobrook, and she somehow got the rights to all these songs. And the McCartney song was interesting. It's called "Did We Meet Somewhere Before?" And he wrote it for Warren Beatty's film Heaven Can Wait as a love song for that film, which is about reincarnation. And Beatty didn't use the song, and the Ramones manager knew McCartney and said, "Could we use your song for $500 and we won't put your name in the advertising?" And he said, "Sure." So we have an original Paul McCartney song, Paul McCartney and Wings, over the credits. And then, of course, they did put his name in the advertising.
Right.
But we have a great score of, you know, Chuck Berry songs and all kinds of fantastic stuff that really fits the period, and very well chosen to fit the scenes. And there was a soundtrack album, and but you know, that helps make the film kind of a, you know, a time capsule of that era of rock and roll, and also it's got a very lively pace. Alan Arkush did an excellent job of directing it. It really moves along, and it's very colorful. And I'm glad you like the graphics. Not only the poster, but the titles, and you know, the film is a very good-looking film. It was shot by the guy who did Jurassic Park. Yeah, the poster by Bill Stout was just wonderful and very colorful. A little exaggerated, like one of the girls' breasts were blown up into much bigger proportions. You know, that's the kind of art they were using back then. But the cinematography was terrific. It was by Dean Cundy, who later did Jurassic Park, and he had done Halloween, which was an influence on our film, and P.J. Souls was in Halloween. And as Alan Arkush said later, one shot in Jurassic Park cost more than Rock and Roll High School, and he wasn't exaggerating. So it was really a miracle this film was made so cheaply. Mike Fennell was the producer, and we got away with all kinds of stuff. For example, we needed a high school to blow up. We blew up the school at the end of the film, and And Alan Arkus said to Roger Corman, well, we'll do a miniature, right? And Roger said, oh, are you kidding? Miniatures are expensive. You got to blow up a real school.
Right.
So they rented a Catholic high school in Watts, which had been closed because of earthquake retrofitting. And it was actually where some of the 50s rock and roll films were shot, and it had the right look. And so what they did was, I went to the night that the film was shot, the blowing up of the school. I played a school board member, and we had a couple hundred kids from some school in Orange County who were extras, and they were bussed in, and they were supposed to be let go, I think, at 10 o'clock to get back home, and they had their SAT exams at 8 a.m., and I don't know how Mike Finnell did this exactly, but he managed to keep them there, which was a miracle, because he had to keep going to the chaperones and saying, oh, we need some more time, we need some more time. And they didn't get out of there till 3 a.m., and as Mike said, we ruined the lives of all these kids because they probably failed their SAT exams. But one way he actually did that, I found out recently, was he actually moved the clocks back in the school to fool them and say, well, it's only actually 8 o'clock or whatever, you know.
Wow.
But when I arrived on the location, being an old reporter, I covered a lot of riots and stuff, and I always check out a location before everything happens. And I saw the special effects man was an old guy named Roger George, who was wearing a gimme cap, and he had a big burn scar on his head, which I thought was not a good sign. And he was putting this flash powder in the windows of the school, and that's how they cause an explosion. They have an electrical charge that makes it go up in a flame for about a minute, and then it dies down. And if you do it correctly, it doesn't damage anything. But I could tell he was putting too much stuff in there, and he was putting it around the roof and everything. So I thought I'll stand across the street with the cops, and I don't think we had firemen there, but we had some policemen. They hadn't told the local residents that they were going to do this, which was not good.
Yeah.
And so finally at 3 a.m. they set off this explosion. It was huge, and Alan says, oh, it's 5 times bigger than I expected, but it wasn't 5 times bigger than I expected. It was big, a little bigger, but I knew it was going to be bad. And it caused a huge fireball, and it set fire to some of the bushes and blew out windows, or it was blowing glass on people. Fortunately, nobody got seriously hurt.
Wow.
The American flag caught on fire and tumbled down in slow motion. They had 5 cameras, and I later told Alan, wow, that's a great shot. You should use it. And he frowned. He said, no, too symbolic. You know, he shied away from certain political things. But at that point, the residents came, pouring out of their houses in their pajamas, looking really upset. You know, what the hell is going on?
Right.
So it was a crazy scene.
I'm sure it was. I'd be shocked myself.
Yeah.
You mentioned Bill Stout, and I just want to bring up the fact that he's the one that did the artwork for Life of Brian, which is George Harrison's project that he put all his money into way back when he did Life of Brian. So I just wanted to bring that up.
Yeah, it ties together. It's interesting. And, when we talk about Hard Day's Night, that film was, probably the greatest rock and roll film. Andrew Saris called it the Citizen Kane of jukebox movies when he reviewed it, which is a famous line. And Alan Arkush, like all directors, thought, hey, let's try to model our film on that, because it had such spontaneity and charm and excitement. And there is a long concert in the middle of Hard Day's Night, which is one of the best scenes. And it was shot. I interviewed Richard Lester for Sight and Sound. I did a book called 2 Cheers for Hollywood, which is my collected pieces, and it's in there. And that's my favorite interview I ever did with a director. He's a really sharp guy, still is. And they filmed that concert on a TV soundstage, TV studio, and they had all these girls screaming. Because when I saw Hard Day's Night in '64 at a theater, you couldn't hear the soundtrack at all because girls screamed all the way through it. I don't know if you remember that.
I remember that.
That's the way it was with the pent-up sexual energy was coming out, I guess. And so Lester just filmed this, and so the girls are screaming. There are a lot of great kind of documentary type shots of the girls screaming and crying, and but the way they mix it, you can hear the songs, but you have a good medley of Beatles songs. But Alan thought naively the Ramones were going to be like the Beatles. They'd be charming and personable, and they weren't. They were very withdrawn, monosyllabic guys with kind of poker faces, and they couldn't talk very well. And but being a good director, what you do is you go with what you have. You know, you change the scenes. So he rewrote the scenes, or had them rewritten, and I wasn't involved in. Yeah, there were 5 writers on the film. I did 5 drafts, and then they brought in a couple of other writers, Russell Devanch and Richard Whitley, and they did the final version, and so they did some rewrites. And Joey has some very funny lines, but it's just like one line at a time. That's about all they could do. Some of those the scene in the dressing room, I think, is very funny, where they're exhausted at the end of the concert and they're eating pizza, and Riff comes in to see them, and so they're very funny because they're so laconic and out of it compared to the Beatles, who are very charming. You know, there's a sequence in Hard Day's Night where they do a press conference and they have very funny, spontaneous answers to the questions from the press. It's a charming scene, you know.
Paul McCartney used the name Paul Ramone, and the band's name seems to have come from that. What do you think when Paul McCartney crosses your mind? I know he offered to do music for Mark Lane's work, Rush to Judgment.
Yeah, yeah. I haven't studied the history of the Ramones enough to know all those stories, but that's an interesting story about the name and the connection. He's always been a fascinating guy. He not only offered to do music for Rush to Judgment, which they rejected because they didn't want music. It's a very stark documentary that doesn't use traditional stuff, but he actually invested some money in Mark Lane's work, and they had a committee supporting Mark Lane, what he did, and so he cared about the Kennedy assassination, and so he cares about political things as well as John Lennon did, you know. And so McCartney also became, you know, very rich, and he owns a lot of songs. He bought a lot of libraries. He owns the song "On Wisconsin," for example, you know, which is the fight song of the school I went to, and apparently they have to pay a royalty to him every time the band plays it, you know.
Wow.
But he's a multifaceted fellow. He seems like a good guy. I never met him or anything, but you know, he's carried on his own very well, even though the Beatles broke up and John Lennon died and Harrison died, you know.
Right. Yeah, I think Paul McCartney used that name when they were the Silver Beatles, I believe. All the band members of the Beatles were using different names. I think Paul's name was Paul Ramone.
Why did he pick the name Ramone? Of course, the Ramones didn't exist at that time because that came later, but why would he use the name Ramone, do you know?
I think it just sounded like it had a mystique, and I know George was Carl Harrison, which he took from Carl Perkins. We know Ringo's name was, you know, taken from the cowboy movies. So they all kind of made up. Yeah.
John Wayne's character in Stagecoach, the Ringo Kid, huh?
Yeah. Thank you, Bob. Of course,
he wore all those rings, too, yeah.
Yeah, thank you, Bob. I appreciate that. Roger Corman is known as the Pope of Pop Cinema. Can you please tell us a little bit about that?
Well, he's a legend, still going on. I think he's 93 now, and somebody just did an interview with him, and he's still producing films, and he says he feels good, he looks great, and he's not going to quit, you know, until he passes on. Then he'll take his money with him, I'm sure, because he's a few years ago, a friend of mine said Roger was worth $400 million, but there was an unpleasant legal dispute with his children about his will, and you could look it up online. They sued him about his will, even though he was still alive, you know.
Wow.
But Roger made a ton of money. He's one of the big things about him is he's very cheap, and Rock and Roll High School teases him about that because under the credits, when his credit appears at the beginning, they dubbed in some birds going cheep, cheep, cheep. You know, I don't think he ever knew that, but you can see it when you see the film.
Well,
But
I have to check that out.
the good thing about him, and this is why I gravitated to him, I came in '73 to Hollywood, and even though the new Hollywood was beginning and they were making some, good youth pictures, the old studio system was still hanging in there, and you couldn't really get a job at a studio unless you were the son of the cameraman or something like that. It was all nepotistic, and a lot of people were very old. The crews were guys in their 50s, 60s, 70s, or whatever. And so the only guy in town who was hiring new young people was Roger Corman. And it was a stroke of genius on his part because he got all these great people working for almost no money. And he had Jack Nicholson acting for him, and he had Francis Ford Coppola and Martin Scorsese and Peter Bogdanovich and Ron Howard. And, a lot of good young directors began with Roger. And Robert De Niro got his first commercial part from Roger. And so he had a great eye for talent, and it was kind of a deal where you'd work for almost no money, but you'd get to make a film with relative freedom within his formula. You had to make a certain kind of exploitation film. And one day when I was working on Rock and Roll High School, he called me in and gave me his 5-minute little talk. I wish I'd recorded it or taken notes about how to make movies. And I remember a few things. He said, we want a lot of nudity, but no fucking, he said. And then he said, a lot of nudity above the waist, no nudity below the waist. I mean, it was like a real strict formula. And he didn't like drugs either. And he said, I had some drug stuff in Rock and Roll High School originally, and he told me to cut that out. But there is some in the film, but not much. And it's actually kind of like a Disney film. It's very wholesome. I had some nudity in there that they cut out, but actually it kind of works because there's a certain innocence and sweetness to the film. But a lot of Roger's films were pretty raunchy at that time, and his formula was 3 girls usually. And so this was a very bad decade for women in film in Hollywood. Very few movies had female protagonists, but Roger's did, and they had 2 or 3 women in the films. And so I thought, okay, well, let's have a female buddy-buddy movie. You see all these male buddy-buddy movies. And Francois Truffaut told me at the time, he thought it was a reaction against feminism, the women's movement, that Hollywood didn't know how to deal with it, so they were making buddy-buddy movies and excluding women. It was very hard to find 5 women to nominate for Oscars. And so I said, okay, we'll make a female buddy-buddy movie, but I didn't make a big point of it because if you're a screenwriter, you start saying stuff like that, they get nervous. I just did it. And so we have these 2 girls who have a good rapport, and they're not really competing against each other for men, which is a bad formula that sometimes happens in films like that. But, they were supportive of each other. And there's one scene I liked that was improvised when the 2 girls talk about Joey Ramone. It's very funny. They're lying in bed just talking about guys, and Kate is talking about Tom, the wholesome jock that she likes, and Riff thinks he's really square, and she's making a face, and then Riff is raving about how handsome Joey Ramone is, which is funny, and the 2 girls just made that up. Alan told them just to make up the dialogue, and Riff pretends that she's after Tom, and Kate starts hitting her with a pillow, and she says, "Oh, I'm just kidding. I wouldn't do that to you." In other words, so making a point of this is not how we're going to behave. So that's one reason the film stands out, I think, because it's one of the few movies of the '70s from Hollywood that's about women.
Right. Yeah, that's cool.
Roger liked to work with women. He had a lot of women on his staff and women producers, and I guess he had a few women directors, some second unit directors, but a lot of crew people. And Frances Dole was a story editor, and she was really integral to his success. She was a brilliant woman who went to Oxford, a British woman. And I worked with her on Rock and Roll High School, and she was just a real pleasure to work with. She was so smart. So he had he didn't have any problem working with women, and made him comfortable, he says. And so that, he's ahead of his time. And He told me once, if you do 3 movies for me, it means you have no talent. In other words, if you're not out of here after 2 movies, there's something
Right.
wrong with you.
Right.
And so most of his people left and went on to bigger things. And I said to him, why don't you? This came because I said, why don't you hold these people to contracts? Have a long-term contract with, I don't know, Ron Howard or Scorsese. And he said, well, the problem is they would resent it because they start getting offers for, big films, and
Right.
I don't want people who are going to resent working for me. And that's smart too,
Yeah. Well, they say behind every good man is a woman, so evidently he had many of them, especially with that much money in his pocket. So,
Yeah, and then later he began collaborating with Julie Corman, who's his current wife, and she's been married to him for a long time, and she was a journalist, and then they hooked up, and she started producing films for him, and she's very smart, and so it became kind of like a collaboration after a while. So, the guy has a lot of, he's a relatively liberal thinker, and he's, although he's very ruthless businessman, in a way, it's supposed to be funny that he's cheap, but in a way it's not funny because we all got sort of underpaid, and Paul Bartel directed Death Race 2000, which is a good black comedy about future, racing, where they kill people with cars and they get points for it. And I wanted to do a film about the 1976 presidential campaign in which every candidate hires assassins to kill the other candidates. And the idea would be the last one that survives gets to be president. Roger thought that was too extreme, But Paul Bartel said, I need $5,000 for roll bars for these cars because the stuntmen tell me they could get killed if the cars turn over, and Roger didn't want to do it. And so Paul said, well, I'm going to quit the film if you don't do that. So good for him. You got Roger to put the roll bars on the cars, but that's the kind of thing he didn't want to do,
Right. Well, this is kind of a 2-part question here. You mentioned Ron Howard. I know Clint Howard was in the movie. Was Ron Howard associated in any way?
No.
And what other directors got to start with Roger Corman?
Well, there's so many. I was just thinking before you asked that, I left out some Jonathan Kaplan, Jonathan Demme. I know I'm missing some big ones. I mentioned Coppola and Scorsese, who were probably the 2 biggest. Ron Howard went on to a big directing career, and Roger let him direct Grand Theft Auto, which was the first kind of mainstream feature. I think it was the first theatrical film he directed, and boy, there are a lot of other ones too that I'm kind of blanking on. But also, Roger released foreign films. He was unusual at the time because he started picking up Fellini films and Truffaut films and Bergman films, and Cries and Whispers, for example, which is a very austere, tragic film, did really well for him, and he was surprised. And one of his most prized possessions on his wall is a letter from Ingmar Bergman thanking him for, he said, it's the first film I've had that played drive-ins. I'm really grateful. Thank you very much.
Wow.
And so I steered Francois Truffaut to Roger. He was a friend of mine, and he told me he was having trouble getting his film, The Story of Adele H, released. And so I said, well, go to Roger. And so he released that and Small Change through Roger. And I got to name Small Change because Roger was too cheap to pay for the rights to use the title Pocket Money, which would have been the literal translation, and he would have had to pay $25,000 to clear the title, and he wouldn't do it. So I thought of Small Change. And but that made Roger stand out because he took chances that other people didn't do, and it paid off for him,
Yeah, I can imagine. Okay, I got one more question, then I'm going to hand it off to the Bulldog. Was the teacher being fired at your dad's high school some inspiration? And where did the idea to blow up the high school in the film come from?
Yeah, when my dad told me the story, I mean, it was ballsy of him as the school body president to lead a strike, and he was a senior, and his father taught at the high school too. And they got national attention. This was 1928. People did stories about them. They were out for a month, and they got the teacher reinstated. I don't know why she was being fired, but it's one of those things. But they got her reinstated. But the kids were so nice in those days. They said, "We'll go back to school for a month in the summer to make up for the time." They wouldn't do that today, but that's where I got the idea, and I began thinking of how would it work today? You need more of a motivation than. Well, in the movie, Paul Bartel is the teacher who is the rebel, and the reason the principal doesn't like him, he likes rock and roll and she doesn't. She thinks rock and roll is the tool of the devil, and
Right.
I remembered people saying that back in the 50s and all. So he doesn't get fired, but he takes a stand with the students and becomes a hipster and rock and roll fan. And so that's kind of based on that lady. And the ending, as I mentioned, was the Army Math Research Center being blown up, which I think one thing Alan Arkush has never understood about the film is the ending, because the way I wrote it was, I covered students' protests and strikes and riots in Madison, and I was a protester against the war, and then I went to work for the local paper, and I was the youngest guy in the staff, so they would send me out every night to cover the riots for 3 years, which at first was kind of exciting, and then I got really kind of OD'd on it, and it was stressful. But I thought I really didn't like violence as a tactic, because as an anti-war tactic, it really turned off the local people who were pro-war, and so the students, there was a hardcore of about 200 who would break windows and set fires and things, and the police would come out and battle with them every night, and they were very brutal, and they would club people over the head, and students would throw rocks. But the police really started it. There was a demonstration in 1967, the Dow Chemical demonstration. Dow was making napalm for the Vietnam War, and we held a protest against them recruiting. And the police should have just let the students occupy the building, but instead they came in with clubs and beat people very severely, and that caused the first big riot. So I was covering all that, and I thought that when the protest became violent, it was only about 200 of thousands of people on campus. The other were just, anti-war people who would protest, but they kind of melded away. What would happen is they'd have a rally with all those people, and then the 200 would have, running battles with the cops, and I'd be running around covering that. And when they blew up the building and a graduate student died, which they hadn't planned for, obviously, but they saw his bicycle outside, and they realized there might be somebody in the building. They should have not done it. And then later, the Greenwich Village bombing took place, where some radicals, the Weather Underground, were making a bomb to put at a dance for soldiers and their girlfriends, and it blew up and killed 3 of them, and that really ended the anti-war movement. And I think it was counterproductive, and Nixon used that as an excuse to attack anti-war people, and it turned off moderate people, and the war went on. And so I thought when you turn to violence like that, it's counterproductive and a sign of failure, and that's what I thought the ending of Rock and Roll High School was about, that these students took over the school, which was appropriate, and then they thought, let's blow it up, which was not helpful. It was self-destructive, and Alan thought it was just a big celebration, but it was supposed to be ironic. But at the end of it, when I saw the preview, I hadn't written this line, but the disc jockey in the film turns to the camera and says, if you want this to happen at your school, just give old Screamin' Steve a call. I'm in the phone book under Screamin'. And I didn't like that, because I thought, oh, well, that's not the point of the movie. It's not like, hey, let's do it at your school. And I don't think Alan ever got that, I mean, frankly. But that was sort of, when you're a writer, your themes get mangled to some extent.
Yeah, my parents used to always say violence incites more violence. So,
yeah.
All right, I'm going to hand it off to the Bulldog. Bob, it's all yours.
Thank you, Warren.
Yeah, thank you.
That was fun. Thanks.
When the Beatles made A Hard Day's Night, the characters were made into caricatures, sort of. Like you go through the stereotypes. John was witty, Paul was cute, George was quiet, Ringo was kind of goofy. As you were asked to write the movie, Evidently you had mentioned before, A Hard Day's Night was definitely maybe a thought, another one of those. What instruction, like, or how did they describe to you, okay, this is what the project is about?
Well, it was very thin. The way Roger worked was, this is part of his cheapness, that he was a Writers Guild signatory, and the Writers Guild price for an original script was $8,000, the minimum. But if you did a rewrite, it was 4,000. So what he would do is he would get somebody to do a quote script. I put that in quotes, and he had Joe Dante and Alan Arkush sit there and with a tape recorder for a few hours and just spitball, kind of an idea for a movie. And somebody typed it up, and they got $200 for this work. And they gave it to me, but it had no plot. And they said, just to say why they gave it to me, I had written a script called Rock City, which was about Dick Clark and American Bandstand, although I changed the names. And I'd sold it to John Davison at New World. He was going to do it for Roger. And Joe, who had grown up in Philadelphia, was going to direct the story scenes, and Alan, who's a huge rock fan, was going to direct the musical scenes. They were both clamoring to direct a film. And then Dick Clark came in the office one day to talk about some project, and Roger walked into Francis Dole's office and said, could you give me that script, Rock City? And he brought it, gave it to Dick Clark. And then he came back and said to Francis, did I make a mistake? And the next day, Dick Clark called him and said, whatever he said, he didn't want the film made because it pokes fun at him to some extent as somebody who exploited youth culture, even though it was a good show. I used to watch it. And so they killed that script, unfortunately. And if we had made it, we would have been ahead of our time, because later was Hairspray and The Idolmaker, and Hairspray has gone on and on in different iterations. But so I was regarded as an expert on teenagers, which is I thought kind of absurd, because I wasn't particularly fond of my peers when I was growing up. And Sam Fuller, who I knew well, the writer-director, I asked him once what he thought of Rebel Without a Cause. He said, I hate these goddamn teenagers and their goddamn problems. And that's kind of how I felt, that a lot of teenage movies were full of sentimentality and self-pity about, we're so picked on and all. But, when they called me in on a Friday and they said, here's this script. It was 60 pages long, and if you can come up with a plot by Monday, we'll let you write the film. So I took it home, and it was really nothing. It was just a high school, and kids were goofing around, and there was really no plot. The only thing that interested me was there was in the chemistry lab, they were making drugs in some kind of like a garbage can. They would pour a lot of stuff in, and it was supposed to be funny. And they had a chimpanzee who was like a subject in their biology lab or whatever. And he drank the drug, and he turned into King Kong. He kept growing and growing and burst through the roof of the school, which was kind of dumb. But I thought, okay, violence. That's interesting, something like that. So then that made me think of, I first thought of my father's story about the strike, and then I thought, violence. Okay, how about they destroy their school? But it's not a monkey who does it, it's the kids, And suddenly it all worked. And I also thought of the French film Zero for Conduct, which is a great surrealist film from 1933 about kids taking over their high school, a tyrannical school. And I had been to, as they say, a couple of very strict Catholic schools, so I could understand fascistic, repressive regimes. So I made it like that, kind of tyrannical school, that the kids are rebelling against the rules, and you need something to rebel against that's real. It's not just because we're dissatisfied. It had to be something concrete. So, but back then they wanted it called Girls Gym as a dummy title. Roger puts dummy titles on scripts because he doesn't want people to know the real title. Like Grand Theft Auto is a great title, and it became later a title of a popular video game. But he didn't want that known at the time he was making the film, so they called it something else. And we were always going to call the film Rock and Roll High School, but Roger said call it Girls Gym. So, but we had a girls gym team which got dropped. But there is an exercise scene in the film which is funny, and that's where they sing the title song. And I had more of that in there. And in my script, it's the gym teacher played by Mary Warrenoff, who was a staple in the Roger Corman stock company, and she was very much like Miss Togar in the film, and she was very strict but kinky, secretly kinky. And so I did several drafts of that, and I developed the two main characters, and then I added the character of Tom, the square jock. I thought it needed some counterpoint to the zaniness. You need a straight man to make it funny. And I knew a guy named Tom Fox at my high school who was our star quarterback, so I thought, okay, I'll do a homage to him. And we needed a square young man, and I could relate to that because I was like that in high school. And so I created most of the characters. And then at some point, Paul Bartel told Alan Arkin, she said, the script isn't zany enough, because mine was sort of comedy drama. It had some moments of actual seriousness. And they brought in these two guys to rewrite it and make it goofier. And they added the Eaglebauer character, who's the mocker, the guy who's selling stuff at the school, fixing football games and selling hall passes and stuff. And he's a funny character, and they modeled him on Sergeant Bilko. And that was their main addition, but they kept the character names and transformed the gym teacher into the principal. And but they rewrote the dialogue, and I write better dialogue than that, frankly. And a lot of the dialogue I found very arch and sort of silly, and a lot of it was ripped off from Woody Allen movies and Bob Hope movies. But I showed it to a friend of mine who's an actress, and I was kind of distressed, and she said, no, this will play well, this is funny, So, and she was right, it does play well. It's parts are really dumb, but the dumbness itself is kind of funny. But the cast was very good, and the director did a great job with it. And so I think it's one of those films where, film is really collaborative art. And you think of other films that I'm not putting this in the same on the same level, but Casablanca was an example of a film that nobody thought was going to amount to anything, but all these people contributed all kinds of stuff, various writers and the director and the actors, and it became this terrific film. Everybody was working at the peak of their powers and bringing different things to it, and that's kind of what happened with Rock and Roll High School on a smaller scale. And it just works, the whole thing really worked. And I give Alan a lot of credit for tying it all together. Ingmar Bergman said a film needs somebody's vision, artistic vision. And I think Alan had a vision of what he wanted, and he kept it together. And he wanted it to be more zany than my vision, but my vision gave it the political underpinning and the level of seriousness, which I think helps make the characters stand for something and mean something. And I think that's one reason it lasts. It's not just a frolic, it's about something. And everybody else contributed very well to, really doing miraculous things on a small budget. For example, PJ Soles was paid something like $300 or some pathetic amount of money for being in the film. And she said, well, where's my costumes? And they said, well, we don't have any budget for costumes. Can you believe this? So she went out to a store, a boutique at the time that was selling punk kind of outfits, and she spent her entire pay of $300 on zany punk outfits that are really colorful and funny, and they really help make the film. If you look at her character, that really is an important element to the character. She understood that. And it's a good visual element. They fit the tone of the film, and they fit the color scheme, and they're very lively. She's like an explosion of energy in the film,
Yeah, for sure. It's something that she went in and did that, even though from what you say, Roger wouldn't pay her back for that. But it definitely
it's not nice. It's not fair,
Sure. One thing about the Ramones is they're in the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. And even though there are documentaries and interviews, they weren't very verbose. And some concerts exist on YouTube. But I think without this movie, their legacy really wasn't captured. The humor in their songs and the underlying pain behind them, I think, was captured perfectly by this type of movie and in the way it was done, because it sort of reflects on them, and I think on one level they were much deeper and very intelligent to write the lyrics that they wrote because there was such humor inherent in them. And I think without this movie, that would have been lost, to a Rock and Roll Hall of Fame band. That the way this was captured, I don't think would have been captured anywhere else, and in large part that's due to you guys putting this movie together.
Yeah, we're very fortunate that happened, and the Ramones. There are some good documentaries in them which I'd recommend, but this is like their only acting film. They wanted to have an acting career, and they never really entered the mainstream because the mainstream thought they were too out there. And films like Beat Up the Brat with a baseball bat, where they're talking about child abuse, and they have a song about glue sniffing, and very edgy subjects that the mainstream stations didn't want to play. And that's to their credit that they dealt with those painful, real subjects, and they did it with black humor, which we understand is a good way to deal with pain. But after Rock and Roll High School, they hooked up with Phil Spector, who he's now in jail, of course, and he wanted to make them over into more acceptable mainstream figures, and he put them in these pastel outfits and had them do an album that flopped. And it was just a huge mistake, and they went back to their punk image after that. And the hood costumes, from the 50s, black leather jackets and torn blue jeans and stuff like that. They were the fathers of punk rock, and the Sex Pistols kind of modeled themselves on them. But that never translated into mainstream appeal. But they had a large following of, there's a level below the mainstream, which is important, cult following, and but it's a good, loyal, big-sized, smart cult. And but this is the only one where they get to play characters they're themselves, but it's sort of a slight caricature, kind of Hard Day's Night was too. They didn't, there wasn't room for depth of exploring who these guys are. Maybe if I had known, with the way when I did the script, I said, "Who's the band going to be?" Alan said, "Have a band come to the school, and that helps trigger the student rebellion." He said, "We don't know yet, so just call them the band and have them show up." And so I just thought of some whatever, and so we didn't have any scenes with them in my script. And then they offered it to a number of bands and performers who didn't get it or turned it down or wanted too much money or too much control or something. But the Ramones, the reason they accepted it, I read, was they liked Roger Corman films of the 50s, like Attack of the Crap Monsters and those kind of films. They understood that low-budget, fun ethos, and they only got $25,000 for making the film, and they did an album from it, but they were kind of struggling financially, and during the shooting, one of them OD'd, and they had some problems, and but I read somewhere they didn't like the film. I don't know if that's really true, because I hope they got to like it, but they're very
like what they got paid.
Huh?
Maybe just their salary.
Yeah, they should have gotten more. One of the problems with Roger is, I really think it isn't funny that he screws people financially. And one thing that happened with me was the Writers Guild came to me and said, you did 5 drafts of the script and you only got paid for 1. I got $4,000 for the rewrite fee, even though I should have gotten $8,000 for an original, really. And then I did 2 other scripts for him, and I didn't get enough for those. And they said, "We'll go after Roger and get the money." And I said, "Fine." And then Alan Arkush called me and begged me not to do that because he and Joe Dante were still working for Roger. And I found even recently they still resent that I did that. They thought they wanted to be nice to Roger, which I think is ridiculous. And so I was going after money for Joe and Alan too, and the 2 other guys, by filing my claim. And Roger resisted this, and then they had a hearing scheduled, and he caved in, like shortly before the hearing, and I got my money. But actually, I got some of my money. The guild ruled that I was due $15,000, and Roger was outraged. He went in to see the president of the guild and somehow talked him into paying me only half of that, $7,500, and I really needed money at the time. I was struggling. And there was another writer, a woman screenwriter, who had filed a claim against him, and she won her claim too. So he was so outraged that he stopped being a Writers Guild signatory, which means that he couldn't work with Writers Guild members ever again. And so what he started doing was getting people from NYU Film School and UCLA and stuff, And I mean, sometimes in the past that worked. He got Francis Ford Coppola from UCLA or whatever. But Roger's films really declined after Rock and Roll High School because he wasn't working with good writers anymore, and he was kind of hurting himself. And I mean, that hurt my career. And the arbitration was also dishonest. The studio picks the credit, and I was given first position credit, and the two other guys second and third, and then Alan and Joe were getting story credit. And I said fine, and then the two other screenwriters objected. They didn't want me to get credit at all. So we had an arbitration, and it turned out the Guild gave first position credit to the other two guys, and then me third, which kind of hurt my career to some extent. And then I heard through the grapevine a few months later, somebody from New World had been called by one of the arbitrators, Mardik Martin, who was a Martin Scorsese screenwriter, and he said, I agreed to do this arbitration, and they sent over all these scripts. I didn't realize there's so much to read, and each writer gets to write a statement. I wrote a 15-page single-spaced statement about what I did in the film, and he said, I don't have time to do all this. What do I do? And this guy said, well, give these other guys first position credit. It was completely corrupt, And every time I've been involved in a Writers Guild arbitration, it's been corrupt. And I quit the business in 1984, partly because it was so corrupt. It really is hard for a screenwriter to function with being screwed all the time. And I'm a much happier person because I write books, which I like doing. And I thought, well, why not do what I really like to do? And when you write a book, you're kind of the head of the studio, in effect. I mean, you have a publisher or you self-publish, but you're pretty much in charge of the product. But in the film writing, you're just a cog in the machine, and they can rewrite and mess up your work in any way they want. Fortunately, Rock and Roll High School came together well, so I'm proud of it and happy with it. But, the behavior of some of the people on the film was not exemplary, let's say.
Now, you mentioned, your books. I want to switch gears. I loved your work Into the Nightmare, My Search for the Killers of President John F. Kennedy and Officer J.D. Tippit. Much more serious than the Ramones movie. But people might be very interested in that. It was a thorough book, first-person research. I don't think anyone else has gotten into the case with more vision and more thoroughness of that research and information. Could you talk about that book? Well, it's easy to say because it's true, but could you talk about that book a little bit and what you think might be today at this date? Will anything possibly go forward from that?
Yeah, well, thanks. I think the motive for my whole life as a writer, which I've been doing for 60 years now, is to look behind the curtain of our society, because we live with a lot of lies. Political parties on both sides are lying to us, and elections are often shams, and there's all kinds of phoniness going on in our culture too. And so I looked behind the curtain, and Kennedy assassination was a huge transformative event for me because I was a volunteer for John F. Kennedy in 1960 in the Wisconsin presidential primary, and I got to meet him twice then and once when he was president. And it meant a lot to me. I was going to become a politician and a lawyer and politician. And then when he got killed, I lost my faith in the democratic system, which I don't think we've had a democracy since then. So it made a huge impact on me, and that's why I became a full-time writer. And so I started following the case from day one. And from day one, I had doubts about it because, first of all, when I heard that he was shot at school, I ran to a drugstore 2 blocks away, and I began listening to the live reports from Dallas, and they were saying the shots came from the front, from the railroad bridge or the grassy knoll, or they called it the hill at that time. And this was 12:40 p.m., 10 minutes after the shooting. And then about 1 o'clock, they started saying the shots came from behind, from this building called the Texas School Book Depository. And I registered, even then I was already a journalist, that, wait a minute, how come they're not telling us why they changed the direction of the shots and, what's their proof of this? And what about those shots from the front? And I knew something was wrong. And that night I began watching Oswald on TV being dragged through the halls, and he said, "I'm just a patsy." I watched that on TV. And at his press conference at midnight, I believed him when he said I didn't shoot anybody. And so I was having doubts from the beginning. And then after a while, I was swayed by the Warren report, like a lot of people were. But when people started questioning the case, I paid attention. And I became a doubter by around 66, 67 again. But it took, I read a lot of books from then on. It was 1982 that I started studying the case seriously in the sense that I thought I will do a book about it now. I'm going to research it and do first-hand research. And I went to Dallas a number of times and interviewed people, witnesses, and they were hard to find. Some people had moved away or were afraid or had been killed or whatever. And I went to Washington a lot because in those days, before the internet, you had to go to the National Archives to look up documents and Xerox them. And it was a big, long job. It took 30 years. And I got to know Penn Jones, Jr., who was a feisty, small-town newspaper editor from outside Dallas, who was one of the first people on the case. And I said to him once, "Do you think the case will ever be solved?" And this is what you hear from a lot of people. And he said, "Well, I think I and a few friends solved it back in the 1960s, which is pretty much true. I mean, we've kind of known the basic facts since then, that the government killed the president and covered it up. And a lot of details have come out, and a lot of millions of pages of documents have come out, et cetera, and still things keep coming out. Although a lot of the witnesses are gone, but there's still a few around, and some of the perpetrators are still with us as well. But the mainstream media have been covering this case up from the beginning, and that's part of the story. So it's independent researchers like me and other people who do it for love and not for money, and just dedicate ourselves to the case, who are really, making progress. And so I thought one thing Penn said to me was, take one aspect of the case, something that isn't covered enough, and research the hell out of it. He would tell this to me and other people. And so I thought, okay, the Tippit murder, I became aware that the murder of the policeman 39 minutes after Kennedy was killed had never really been investigated at all properly. 2 days after the shooting, when Oswald was killed, the Dallas police basically dropped the investigation of the officer's murder, which is strange. And then the Warren Commission hardly investigated it. And the House Select Committee did some investigating, but not enough. And Gary Muir did an unpublished book in 1971, a short book that was good, but that was about it. And so I made it my point to really do the first real deep investigation of that case. And it's a fascinating case. It's one of the Warren Commission lawyers called it the Rosetta Stone of the case, and he meant that Oswald shot Tippit and that solves the case. But it's a non sequitur to think, even if he shot the policeman, which I don't think he did, that doesn't prove he killed the president. But a lot of people make that irrational leap. They think, well, why else would he kill Tippit if he didn't kill Kennedy? But when you look at the Tippit evidence, the witnesses have very different stories to tell. Some of them saw two men involved, different people. It's like there are two sets of witnesses, almost literally, that some said Oswald did it, or a guy who looked like Oswald, and the other half said, no, two guys did it. The guy was short and heavy, and et cetera, et cetera. And it's a real complicated case. But the ballistics evidence does not implicate Oswald. It clears Oswald because they couldn't prove it came from the gun that was allegedly taken from it at the theater soon after that. And a writer named John Armstrong has proved that Oswald did not own the pistol or the rifle that were allegedly used in the case, the Kennedy and Tippit shootings. And so I believe that Tippit drove into an ambush and was shot by other people. And I also found out from interviewing his father, who nobody had ever interviewed, a very interesting man, that Tippit was sent with another policeman to try to track down Oswald shortly after the assassination. This was proof of conspiracy because the Dallas police supposedly did not know who Oswald was until they arrested him, and he got to the police station and they found ID on him, but he had two sets of IDs, etc. But as you know, as early as about 12:45, Tippett and this other policeman, William Menzel, were sent looking for Oswald in Oak Cliff, where he lived, and so that's very suspicious. And it's not clear if they were supposed to arrest him or kill him, but I think he was supposed to be killed on the street and or in the theater. And the other policeman didn't get there in time. He had a collision, and this is all new to in my research. I found this out, and Tippett made it, and he was killed in an ambush, I believe. It was a setup, and why that happened is something I explore in great detail in my book. Why he was used as a scapegoat, but he was involved in the plot in some way to silence Oswald or. And possibly in other elements of the plot. It gets very complex. So I wrote this 600-page book about it, and I'm glad people keep buying it from around the world. I self-published it. It's not the kind of book you get a regular publisher to publish, but it's done very well, and I'm really happy that you and other people find it eye-opening.
Well, it's Into the Nightmare, My Search for the Killers of President John F. Kennedy and Officer J.D. Tippett. It covers the ballistics evidence, a biography of Tippett. It got the only interview with Tippett's father, Edgar Lee Tippett, which he went down and picked up. You talk about the discrepancies and, the cartridge shells being of different manufacturer, the signature of Officer J.M. Poe not on one of the bullets, and the strange whereabouts of Tippett during this time. It's a fascinating book, and if you're interested in the Kennedy assassination, don't listen when they say we'll never figure it out. They might not admit it, but I think people like Joe have helped us to figure it out and understand what happened. But you have another book, a couple of books.
Oh, could I add one thing? Because I didn't answer one of your questions.
One of my favorite subjects.
Yeah. I just want to answer one question that should be of interest to your listeners. That a lot of documents came out because of the Oliver Stone film JFK. They put a credit there at the end saying, how come the government is withholding a lot of documents? And that was really embarrassing to the government. So they passed a law that all the remaining documents had to be released with certain exceptions for national security and the usual things like that. And so literally millions of pages of documents were released. But by 2017, they were all supposed to be released unless some serious objection was made by an agency. And President Trump announced that he was going to release all the documents, and a day or two before the deadline, legal deadline, he said, "Oh, I've changed my mind." The CIA and the FBI got to him and persuaded him not to release more than 1,000 documents, and some of them are very long, hundreds of pages, So it's suspicious that they are still covering up documents. We have an awful lot, and you can access them online, but what are they hiding? And of course, a lot of documents were destroyed and altered as well. But at this point, if a lone crazy gunman shot Kennedy for no motive, they really never could identify a motive. Why would they be covering up documents at this very late date, 56 years plus later? I mean, it's crazy. Huh?
Excellent point, and we'd love to see those released. Thank you for that book. It is one of the books that stuck with me, and if I had to pick, I've read over 100 books in the Kennedy assassination. I'm not saying that, look at how many I read, but rather to say this one, maybe in 100 and some odd I've read, that this one would come out. If I said 5 were essential, I would include this one.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
You wear many hats. You've done 2 works on Frank Capra, one of my favorite films every Christmas, or when I'm feeling down, is It's a Wonderful Life. Speaking of JFK, Kevin Costner's Jim Garrison reminds me somewhat of a cinematic Jimmy Stewart. Could you talk about your 2 books a little bit on Capra and maybe the tie to Jim Garrison being portrayed as sort of a Mr. Smith Goes to Washington?
Yeah, I interviewed Oliver Stone several times after JFK came out. I'd met him long before that, but he said he was thinking of Mr. Smith when he made JFK, that he the Costner character in the film is Jim Garrison, but he also has elements of some of the other researchers. He kind of knows more than Garrison knew an awful lot, but there are elements of things that Penn Jones and other Mark Lane did, but he thought of him as like the Stewart character, the kind of naive idealist who gets wised up and exposes governmental corruption. And Stone's wife told me when he was after the film came out, when he was being attacked a lot by the press, he was reading my book on Capra, 1992 biography, Frank Capra, The Catastrophe of Success, which was on his night table, she said, and he read it every night. So there are similarities there. And I spent 7.5 years researching the life of Frank Capra, who was one of my favorite directors, and actually he still is. Even though I learned so much, I exposed a lot of things about Capra that people didn't know. He had a myth that he helped create, and the media collaborated in it. And he wrote an autobiography, the name above the title is very seductive, and most people believed it. I believed it at the time. But when I started being troubled by elements of it that didn't match what I was finding out about Capra, I got to know him in 1975, and then I wrote the American Film Institute Life Achievement Award special about him in 1982, and I got to know him quite well and met other people who knew him and worked with him. And I found out that his autobiography is virtually complete fraud. It's like a novel about Hollywood, and almost nothing in there is accurate historically. And so it took me 7.5 years to tremendous amount of research to nail down the facts. And I interviewed 175 people. I interviewed Capra for a year before he had a stroke, and I got a lot from him, although he tried to lie and cover things up. It was sort of like a game. If I would find something out through a document or with an interview with somebody else, he would then confirm it and talk about the reality. But I had to kind of find out first. Like he claimed he never had a girlfriend in college. He just worked all the time, and I found out that wasn't true, that he had trouble in college and he had a serious girlfriend. And so I found her, and she gave me great interviews, and so I would ask him about things, and he would admit the truth, And he also claimed he didn't work in films till 1921 when he walked into his studio and BS'd his way into a job saying he was a director, and he really claimed he had no experience. But in fact, he'd been working in films for several years before that, and he didn't put that in his book because he wanted people to think he was this amazing genius who just walked in off the street and directed films. But it took me a long time to piece together the very interesting story of his actual apprenticeship. But the main thing that was newsworthy in the book was I found out he was an informer during the blacklist period. He was a very patriotic man. He was an immigrant from Sicily and truly loved America, and he made the Why We Fight films and other films in World War II for the Army, propaganda films, and really believed in America, and America turned on him and kicked him in the teeth after the war, when the Red Scare hysteria took over Hollywood. People like him who had been making films of social criticism in the 30s were suspect. They called them premature anti-fascists, which is a real Orwellian term. If you were anti-fascist too early, there was something suspect about you. And if you criticized the Congress like you did in Mr. Smith, or rich people like you did in Mr. Deeds, Goes to Town, etc., there's something, you were a commie, And it turned out he had worked with a lot of communist and left-wing and liberal writers, as well as some moderates and conservatives. And so he was vulnerable on that score. Some of the charges leveled against him were ridiculous. Like, they said that he was pro-Russian during World War II. Well, they were our allies. He made a film called The Battle of Russia, and it was somewhat distorted, but a pretty good film. And, why wouldn't he be pro-Russia in World War II? But the thing about working with left-wing writers was true, but being a left-winger or right-winger, whatever, is your right under the Constitution, and it's not supposed to be a crime. And Capra, however, reacted by informing on some of his writers. What happened was he was on a think tank for the U.S. government in 1951 at Caltech, which was his alma mater, and they were studying secretly what would happen if World War III broke out in Europe. If the Russians invaded Eastern Europe or Germany or whatever, what would we do? and Capra was the head of psychological warfare, and his security clearance was withdrawn, which shocked him. And then he got a letter with these charges against him, and he answered them in a long document that I read. And in there, he started blaming his writers basically for the themes of his films. Basically, he was saying, "My writers made me do it." And he mentioned several people who he said were communists, and or he suspected they were communists or whatever, And some of this was rather vague, as a lot of the charges were against people in that period, which was one of the problems. And so he got a provisional clearance, but it was never quite the same for him, and he was very embittered by that, as you might expect. But he had compromised his values because he was a believer in his films, a believer in the Constitution, the First Amendment, and he violated the principles of Mr. Smith Goes to Washington by informing on people, including on the writer of that film, Sidney Buckman, who was the main screenwriter, a great script. He was a member of the Communist Party when he wrote that, and one of Capra's closest aides told me one of the best things about Capra in his prime that made him a great popular artist was he worked with people of different political persuasions. He worked with communists and liberals and conservatives like Miles Connolly, and he would take ideas from all of them and sort of, put them together into the synthesis of what the audience wanted. And yet he was making films that were very popular, pro-New Deal kind of progressive, relatively progressive films. They had some contradictory elements, which always baffled the critics until I sorted this out. The reason they were contradictory was he had different writers working with, and also he was a lifelong Republican, and he was working with Robert Riskin, who was a New Deal Democrat, for example, and people never considered that's why the films seemed to be divided against themselves. And so I went into all that in great detail. It took a long time to research, and then I had a lot of opposition to the book. Janine Basinger, who was Capra's archivist at Wesleyan University, at first let me in to see his papers and promised complete access, and that I could quote from any papers because they had the copyright to them, and Frank and Lou Capra donated the papers. And I sold the book to Knopf, which is part of Random House, and Robert Gottlieb was my editor, who was a very distinguished editor who edits Robert Caro's books and a lot of important books. And they began turning against me because of what I was finding out. They wanted a sanitized version of the book. It's a long story, but they basically were putting up roadblocks. She was hiding documents and starting to change her tune about whether I could quote from them, even though she made promises to me that I could quote anything I wanted. She started pretending that they didn't have the copyright, and all kinds of lies were told. And then Gottlieb, strangely, went along with her. He became close friends with her and started publishing her books, including a book on It's a Wonderful Life. And so I engaged in a legal battle for 3.5 years with Knopf, Random House, over just to get the book published. And I found out what they wanted to do was either kill the book or publish an expurgated version, take it over and edit it without my involvement, and sanitize it of most of the troublesome material. That's what they wanted to do. And I didn't obviously want that to happen, but it was a long legal battle. It's kind of a Kafkaesque story. It has some elements of black humor in it. I wrote a book about it called Frankly Unmasking Frank Capra, which came out last year. And I kept meticulous notes because my lawyers advised me to have a paper trail. So I wrote down every conversation, had notes on all the conversations, and I have all the letters. And every time I talked to them, I'd write a memo about it and things like that. So it's a long story about how a writer trying to tell the truth about an American iconic cultural figure is facing tremendous obstacles to try to get the truth out. And that, I think, tells you a lot about our country, that we really resist the truth about our history. And this ties in with my other interests about Kennedy assassination and other subjects, that we live in a country that Gore Vidal calls the United States of amnesia. We live by a lot of myths, and we don't want a lot of people don't want to know the truth because it's too upsetting. And but I really want to know the true story. I don't like being lied to. But it took a tremendous battle, and I think it's a good story. And there was a friend of mine who was a Pulitzer Prize winning writer, became a Pulitzer Prize winning writer later, and he said, "This is the strangest story I've ever heard. This is really shocking." And it's quite a story. It's quite suspenseful, I think. So I hope people will read that book and the Capra biography. This new book, frankly, is kind of volume 2 of my Capra biography. Frank Capra, The Catastrophe of Success, is volume 1. One reason I wrote it, somebody said to me after the first book came out, they said, "Well, I like the book, but there's something missing." And I said, "What's that?" And he said, "Well, there should be a chapter on how you wrote the book, because that's part of Capra's story, isn't it? I mean, that he worked with you on, you were trying to find out the story from him, and he was resisting, and then he was cooperating, and one thing after another, and this is part of the story, how the myth was exposed." And I thought, well, that guy had a point. So I kind of thought about that for a long time, and I finally wrote that book.
Well, it's funny how things tie together, in the same themes. People want to present themselves as respectable, and if you have enough money, you can present yourself as respectable. And the people under you are afraid to speak up because, they need their jobs, basically. And that seems to be a theme through, a lot of why the truth isn't spoken of. And we have a lot of elephants in the room in our history that we'd be far better off purging, which has been a quest of yours in these wonderful books. And another director, Ernst Lubitsch. When I read your work on him and we discussed it before, I realized the Jimmy Stewart movie, The Shop Around the Corner, which I had enjoyed, was one of his films. And I got more deeply into him due to your work, which is a compliment. Tell us about that work.
Yeah, thank you. Well, Ernst Lubitsch is a wonderful director, and people who see his films fall in love with them when I show them to students. But most people probably haven't heard of him anymore. He was a household name when he was working. He was highly regarded by all his peers, and he was very popular, and critics loved him. He was the inventor of the romantic comedy and the musical, and he made the most sophisticated, sexy, highly intellectual films. Trouble in Paradise, Ninotchka, Shop Around the Corner, To Be or Not to Be, just a few of his great films. And but he died in 1947, and the kind of whole world that he represented sort of had already died. The kind of world in which, he was outwitting the censors to get points across. As part of the charm and the fun of his films is how he has a lot of sexual innuendo that's not at all crude, but it gets the points across in a clever way. People enjoyed that. But he introduced a new level of sophistication and adult attitude toward sexuality to American cinema. He came from Germany, and he brought a continental attitude toward sexuality and revolutionized American films. But then after he died, the world changed a lot, and things became more coarse and crude, and a lot of his films weren't watched much. But people who see them, like when I saw Trouble in Paradise in college, I thought, wow, this is a great film. This is the first Lubitsch film I saw, and I thought, I've just seen this guy's masterpiece. Even though it's the first one I saw, I thought nobody could top this, and I was right. After seeing all his existing films, I still think that's his best film. And so I decided to write this book because one reason was I was having trouble seeing his films until recently. A lot of them were not out on home video, and some of them have never been released in America, especially the German films, and some of the silent American films are hard to see. So I selfishly wanted just to see the films, so I thought, well, if I do a book, it'll give me a reason to go to Europe and see the films. And I programmed a series of his complete retrospective of his work at the Locarno Festival in Switzerland in 2010. And I did this critical study, How Did Lubitsch Do It?, which is a title inspired by Billy Wilder, his most famous acolyte and protege. And he had a sign in his office on the wall that said, "How would Lubitsch do it?" In other words, that was his touchstone. He said, "I never wanted to write a line that would embarrass my good friend Ernst Lubitsch." And so Wilder and other directors have tried to make films in his vein. It's hard to do now because the world is so different, but the films represent a better world than we live in. They're more gracious and charming and funny and witty. And The Shop Around the Corner is a popular film, as you imply. It's a film people love, and To Be or Not to Be is very highly regarded today. It was a black comedy about Nazism that sort of shocked and offended people at the time, but people didn't understand black comedy. I didn't know what black comedy was until I saw Dr. Strangelove in 1964. And the first time I saw that, I didn't quite get it. And the second time I saw it, I sat through it twice, I got it. But To Be or Not to Be is an astonishing film today. So I wrote this book. It took 9 years. I did other books in the meantime, but I was going to Europe and getting copies of his films and studying them. It was a really fun book to do, to watch Lubitsch films over and over. And I also found a lot of old interviews with him and press releases and things. All this stuff had been kind of forgotten, in which he talked about his working methods in ways that were very revealing and very candid and very intelligent, and people didn't really know about these documents. And so I wrote a book that was, kind of how did he make his great films and analyzing them in depth. And it just came out in paperback from Columbia University Press, which published the book in hardcover in 2018. So the paperback just came out a couple days ago, and I'm very happy the book has been well received. And I keep finding people coming up to me at signings or writing me notes saying, I'm a huge Lubitsch fan. Thank you so much for writing this book. And his daughter, Nicola, for example, has become a friend of mine, and she said, this is the book I've been waiting for all my life. It helps explain my father to me, and that's nice to hear. And Molly Haskell, great film historian, said, this is, we who love Lubitsch have been wanting a book like this, and it's so good that it came out in our lifetime. So there are pockets of Lubitsch fans that I've been finding, which is nice when you write a book and they come out of the closet, so to speak, and hope to make more fans. If you like a Lubitsch film, see a couple of Lubitsch films and then read the book and then see more. And some people write to me and they say, well, I'm watching the films as I go along with your book, and that's a good way to read the book, and I think that's very nice to hear. So I think people are delighted. One thing my students say is, my God, this guy was so sophisticated about sexuality and so understanding of human nature, 100 years ago or 90 years ago. This is amazing. We don't tend to think of the past as more sophisticated than today, but it was, in his case and in the case of a few other directors, who were much more sophisticated than the run of films generally are today.
Well, you've taken us to many places where people don't want to look, and that's a good thing. But when we do look, we learn a lot, and good things are exposed. So I turn it over now to Warren.
Thank you.
Thanks, Bob. I appreciate that. Do you have any websites or Amazon pages? Where can listeners find your work?
Oh, yeah, thank you. Well, I've actually got 5 websites, if you're prepared for this.
Okay.
Every time I do a book, sometimes I self-publish books that are, ones that are too dicey for normal publishers, and I've done 3 of them, and 4 of them, actually. And then I go with the regular publisher for certain books. So I have a website called josephmcbridefilm.com, which is my general website where I have overview of my career, and I have some articles and photographs and things. And individual books, I have intothenightmare.com, thebrokenplaces.info, twochairsforhollywood.net. That's my collection of my short pieces over the years. And franklycapra.com, which is about the new book, Frankly, Unmasking Frank Capra. And people can read parts of the books on these sites and see photographs and study them, and I hope that they will do that. And the books are all available on Amazon. Most of my books are in print, and it's nice to have new readers discover them. So I appreciate you guys talking about them.
Yeah, that's no problem. Do you have any upcoming events, book signings, or anything like that you want to get out there?
Well, at the moment, I'm not doing any book signings that are planned, although I do interviews and things. I do podcasts and I do personal appearances. I'll probably be at the San Francisco Silent Film Festival this this spring. It's a great event. I'll introduce some film and signed books. I'm writing a book on Billy Wilder right now, who, as I mentioned, was Lubitsch's most famous and successful protege, and I've loved his films for a long, long time. And he's a bawdy, candid guy about sex and a very caustic social critic. Went beyond Lubitsch in some of those areas, and but he's also a very graceful director who understood people. He's kind of a closet romantic, I think, and in his later work he got more romantic as the world was getting more coarse. So I've been studying and writing about him for more than 50 years, and people have seen Some Like It Hot and The Apartment, and a lot of great Wilder films are all available on home video, at least the ones he directed. The ones he wrote are hard to see. So I've been spending a lot of time on the films he made in Germany and his early Hollywood films as a writer, and that's very interesting to me too. I like to see how people evolve. And then I go into great depth on his career as a director, so I'm working hard on that book. And that's, again, really fun because Wilder's films are hilarious. Some are dramas, some are comedy dramas, poignant, but very compelling filmmaker, and just somebody I've really admired for a long time. And I got to interview him a number of times. I never got to meet Lubitsch because he died the year I was born, but Wilder, I went on the set of The Front Page in 1974 and watched him shooting, and I interviewed him on numerous occasions, and I interviewed other people who worked with him, so it's a somewhat different kind of book. And I've taught a course on Lubitsch and Wilder, and I realized they're very similar, but they're also very different, which makes it interesting. And it's a challenge to deal with Wilder because a lot of his themes are kind of subterranean and subtle things. He's a kind of subversive filmmaker who critiques American society, and he's a European who came from what is now Poland, but he lived in Vienna, and he lived in Germany, and he fled Hitler. And so like Lubitsch, he's a link, cultural link between Europe and America, and they both comment very knowingly on contrasts between our two cultures. So it's a natural follow-up to the Lubitsch book, and I've been having a great time writing this book on Billy Wilder.
Wow, interesting stuff. Good, interesting books. Very nice to read. I appreciate you being on the show, and very good information. You're a very good guest. I love having you on. And we have a tradition on this show of closing out with a Beatles song called The End. It's not about great singing. Of course, I can't sing at all either. People are going to get up and walk away when I start. But it's a lot of fun. We have all of our guests do it. And would you mind singing that with us?
Well, with one caveat, can I tell you a little story? It's kind of funny. I think I'm really the world's worst singer. You may be bad, but I'm worse. I can guarantee you. I can't carry a tune, although I've sung in 3 movies, oddly enough. But I worked on a Fred Astaire tribute for the AFI with Nelson Riddle, the great arranger and composer. He worked with Fred Astaire and Judy Garland and Frank Sinatra. And the producer said, would you guys, you and Hermes Pan, who is Fred Astaire's choreographer, would you record a song, which was a parody of They Can't Take It Away From Me? We'll send it to male stars and see if they'll come out and sing it in tribute to Fred. And I didn't want to do, I thought it was a bad idea, but I wrote it, and then Nelson Riddle said, you guys sing it, and I'll do the piano, and we'll tape it. And I said, well, I can't sing. And he said, all nonsense, everybody can sing. So I said, well, okay. So we did the song, and then at the end of it, Nelson Riddle looked up at me in shock, and he said, you weren't kidding. You really can't sing. I thought that was kind of nice.
Well, put it this way, I'm right along those lines. So Bob will take the beginning. If you don't mind, you can talk the middle.
Okay.
And I'll try to sing the end.
Great. Could I just mention something when you asked me about my website? Somehow I forgot about the one for the Lubitsch book. It's called HowDidLubitschDoIt.com. So you run the title together, howdidlubitschdoit.com. It's got a lot of pictures and a lot of excerpts in the book and stuff. But anyway, look forward to our bizarre singing of a Beatles song here.
And I'll make sure I put that in there, and I'll probably use some pictures from the website to put on the video.
Oh, great. Thank you.
No problem. And Bob, it's all yours. Take her away.
All right. And in the end,
the love you take
is equal to the love you made. I thank you very much, Joe. Very good show. Very informative.